On my son's birthday, with the whole room buzzing and everyone watching, I stepped forward to hug him, and he shoved me away so hard I almost lost my balance, his voice sharp and loud when he said, "Don't touch me, you can't see." The room went silent in that awful, heavy way, and every pair of eyes turned toward me as if I'd done something unforgivable just by existing. I stood there frozen, my hand still half raised, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my chest. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a teenage outburst or a bad day. This was something deeper, something that had been building for years. I'm still asking myself the same question even now, and I want you to tell me honestly, was I wrong for how I handled what came next? Or would you have done the same thing in my place? I guess to understand how we got to that moment, I have to start from the beginning, before the silence, before the bitterness, before my own son looked at me like I was an embarrassment he couldn't wait to escape. I lost my sight when my son was 4 years old. It wasn't sudden like an accident in one dramatic moment. It was slow, cruel, and relentless. A degenerative condition, the doctors said, something genetic that no one had caught early enough. At first, it was just blurry patches, shadows where there shouldn't have been shadows. Then faces started losing their edges, colors dulled. I remember sitting on the floor of our living room one afternoon, my son playing with his toy cars, and realizing I couldn't tell which one he was holding anymore. I laughed it off then, made a joke about needing stronger glasses, but inside I was terrified. By the time he started kindergarten, I was legally blind. I could see light, vague shapes, movement if it was close, but details were gone. My world shrank in ways I didn't even understand at first. Simple things became complicated. Crossing the street, pouring a cup of coffee, reading bedtime stories which had been my favorite thing to do with him. I adapted, learned to use audiobooks, learned routes by memory, learned to listen harder. What I didn't realize was how much my blindness was changing my son's world too. His mother, my wife at the time, tried to be supportive in her own way, but stress does strange things to people. Money became tighter when I had to stop working my old job. I picked up freelance work I could do with screen readers, but it wasn't the same. Arguments started creeping in, quiet at first, then louder. I heard my name paired with words like burden and responsibility more than once, even when she thought I couldn't hear her. Kids hear everything, even when you think they're distracted. Especially then, when my wife left, my son was 7. She said she needed stability, that she couldn't raise a child and take care of me at the same time. She told me it would be better for him if she had primary custody. I fought it, but courts don't always look kindly on blind parents, no matter how capable you are. In the end, we shared custody, but he spent most of his time with her. I went from seeing him every day to every other weekend, and those weekends became the center of my entire existence. I tried so hard to be a good parent within the limits of what I could do. I memorized the layout of parks so I could walk with him. I learned to cook his favorite meals by touch and smell. I recorded myself reading stories so he could listen to them at night even when he wasn't with me. When he talked about school, I listened with everything I had, because listening was the one thing I could still do perfectly. But as he got older, something shifted. His answers became shorter. He spent more time on his phone when he was with me. When I asked about his friends, he'd shrug. When I asked about his feelings, he'd roll his eyes. People say that's just teenagers, but this felt different. There was a distance there, a wall I couldn't find my way around. I noticed it most when we were in public. At restaurants, he'd walk a few steps ahead of me instead of beside me. If I reached for his arm to guide myself through a crowded space, he'd tense up. Once, when I accidentally bumped into a chair, I heard him sigh in that exaggerated way that says more than words ever could. It hurt, but I told myself he was just embarrassed, that it was normal, that he'd grow out of it. I didn't want to be the parent who tripped their kid for feelings they didn't choose. His birthdays used to be my favorite days. Even after the divorce, even after the blindness, I tried to make them special. I'd save up for months to get him something he really wanted. One year it was a gaming console. Another year a new bike I couldn't see but knew was red because the salesperson told me, and because red had always been his favorite color. I'd planned small gatherings, nothing too overwhelming for me to navigate, just family and a few friends. As he got older, the parties got bigger, louder, more chaotic, usually hosted by his mom. I was invited, but I could tell I was more of an obligation than a guest. The year he turned 16 was the year everything finally cracked. His mom insisted on throwing a big party at her house. Friends, relatives, decorations everywhere. I almost didn't go. Crowded spaces exhaust me, and I had a bad feeling I couldn't quite explain. But it was his birthday, and I didn't want to be the absent parent, so I went. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes I knew were clean and presentable because I couldn't check in a mirror the way other people do. I practiced navigating her living room in my head, counting steps, remembering where the couch should be. When I arrived, the noise hit me immediately. Music thumping, laughter, voices overlapping. Someone guided me inside, and I could feel the way conversations shifted when people noticed me. The polite hellos. The awkward pauses. I heard my son's voice somewhere across the room, deeper than I remembered, laughing with his friends. That sound alone made the trip worth it. I stood there for a moment just listening, smiling like an idiot. Eventually, it was time for the cake. Everyone gathered around. Someone turned off the music. The candles were lit, and I could feel the warmth from them, even though I couldn't see the flames. People sang. I sang too, off-key, not caring. When the song ended, there was clapping, cheering, and in that brief pocket of joy, I stepped forward. I just wanted to hug my son, just for a second, just to feel him there, to remind myself, and maybe him too, that no matter how old he got, I was still his parent. That's when he shoved me away. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't subtle. His hands hit my shoulders and I stumbled back, catching myself on the edge of a table. The room went dead quiet. I could feel it, that collective intake of breath people make when something goes very wrong. His voice cut through the silence, loud and angry and sharp enough to slice me open. Don't touch me. You can't see. For a split second, I didn't understand what he meant. Then it hit me all at once. The implication, the accusation, as if my blindness made my touch wrong, invasive, embarrassing, as if I'd crossed some line just by reaching out. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else muttered his name like a warning. His mom rushed over, hissing at him to apologize, but he just stood there, breathing hard. I could feel his anger radiating off him, hot and raw. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to sink into the floor and never come back up. I mumbled something, I don't even remember what, and backed away, my face burning. I didn't cry then. I refused to. I sat through the rest of the party like a ghost, listening to conversations swirl around me. Every word a reminder that I didn't belong there. When it was finally acceptable to leave, I did, making some excuse about a headache. No one tried to stop me. No one followed. That night, alone in my apartment, I finally broke down. I cried until my chest hurt, until my head throbbed. Not just because of what he'd said, but because of what it confirmed. That deep down, my own son saw me as less, as a problem, as something to be pushed away. In the weeks after, he didn't call, didn't text. When it was my weekend, he told his mom he didn't want to come. She relayed the message like a neutral third party, but I could hear the edge in her voice too. Part of me wanted to fight, to demand my time, to force him to see me. Another part of me was so tired of feeling like I was constantly begging for scraps of affection. I replayed that moment over and over in my head, the shove, the words, "you can't see," as if that erased everything else. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee I'd comforted, every sacrifice. I started wondering if maybe he was right, if maybe my presence really was more harmful than helpful. Maybe letting go would be kinder. But then something happened that shifted my thinking. A few months later, I ran into one of his old teachers at the grocery store. She recognized me by my voice. We talked for a bit, and she mentioned how bright my son was, how kind he used to be, how he'd talk about me all the time when he was younger. She said, "He was so proud of you, you know. He used to tell everyone how strong you were." That sentence hit me harder than anything my son had said. Proud of me, strong. I went home and sat in the dark, thinking about that kid. The one who'd once held my hand without hesitation, who'd once defended me when other kids asked why his dad used a cane. Somewhere along the way, that pride had turned into shame, and I didn't think it was entirely his fault. I started to realize how much his environment had shaped him. The comments he must have heard, the looks, the way people pitied him for having a blind parent, as if that was some kind of tragedy he had to overcome. Kids internalize that stuff. They absorb it until it becomes their own voice, so I made a decision. Not a big dramatic one at first, just a quiet resolve. I wasn't going to disappear. I wasn't going to let that moment define our relationship forever. But I also wasn't going to keep subjecting myself to humiliation without saying anything. I wrote him a message, long and careful, explaining how much that moment had hurt me, how I loved him, how I wanted to understand what he was feeling. I didn't accuse. I didn't guilt trip. I just told the truth. He didn't reply. Weeks went by, then months. Every day I checked my phone, my heart jumping at every notification, only to sink again when it wasn't him. I tried calling once. It went to voicemail. I left a message telling him I was there whenever he was ready. My voice sounded calm, but inside I was unraveling. That silence did something to me. It forced me to sit with my own pain instead of pushing it aside for his comfort. It made me angry in a way I hadn't let myself feel before. Angry at the system that doubted me, angry at my ex for reinforcing the idea that I was a burden, angry at myself for always shrinking, always apologizing for taking up space. And that's where I'll pause this part of the story, because this was the moment everything started to change. I was standing at a crossroads between continuing to swallow my hurt and finally standing up for myself, even if it meant risking the little connection I had left with my son. In the next part, I'll tell you what I decided to do, how it led to a confrontation I never imagined, and whether it brought us closer or pushed us even further apart. After months of silence, after replaying that birthday moment so many times it felt etched into my bones, I reached a point where the waiting itself hurt more than any rejection ever could. Every day I told myself I'd give him space, that he was young, that he needed time, but every night I lay in bed wondering if this was how our story would end, not with a dramatic goodbye, but with quiet absence. And I'll be honest with you, that's when the darkest thoughts started creeping in. Thoughts like maybe he'd be better off without me entirely. Maybe my presence really was just a reminder of something he wished didn't exist. But then I'd remember his laugh as a little kid, the way he used to climb into my lap without asking, the way he'd grab my cane and march around pretending to be me, saying he was Dad the Explorer. And something inside me would harden. I wasn't ready to be erased from my own child's life. So one afternoon, after yet another unanswered message, I made a choice. I decided I was done speaking into a void. If he wasn't responding because words on a screen were too easy to ignore, then I needed to be present in a way he couldn't swipe away. I called his mother and told her I wanted to talk to him in person. Not argue, not yell, just talk. There was a long pause on the line, the kind where you can practically hear someone weighing how much trouble something might cause. She finally said she'd ask him, but she didn't sound hopeful. When she called back later that evening, her voice was tight. She said he didn't want to see me, that he said I made him uncomfortable. That word hit me like a slap. Uncomfortable. Not angry, not confused, just uncomfortable, as if I were an old piece of furniture that didn't fit the room anymore. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, cane resting against the wall, listening to the hum of the city outside my window, and I realized something painful but clarifying. My son was learning how to treat me from the adults around him, and maybe, without meaning to, I'd taught him too. I'd taught him that it was okay to push me aside because I always stepped back. I'd taught him that my feelings came second because I always made them second. And if that was the lesson he'd absorbed, then it was on me to change it. A week later, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to his school. I didn't tell his mother. I didn't ask permission. I just went. I knew the lay, out well enough from past visits, and I checked in at the front office like any other parent. I could feel the receptionist's hesitation when I gave my name, that subtle shift when people realize they might have to help you more than they expected. She asked why I was there. I told her I wanted to speak to my son. She said she'd have to check. I waited in a plastic chair, hands folded, heart racing, feeling like I was about to either lose him forever or finally break through. When he walked into the office, I knew it was him before he said a word. Parents know their kids like that. His footsteps had changed, heavier, more confident, but still unmistakably his. He stopped a few feet away from me and didn't say anything at first. The silence stretched, thick and awkward. Finally, he sighed and said my name, not Dad. Just my name, and there was so much irritation in it that I almost turned around and left right then. I told him I wasn't there to embarrass him or cause a scene. I told him I just wanted to talk somewhere private. He said we could talk there, that he didn't care. That stung, but I pushed through it. I told him I loved him. I told him I missed him. I told him that what happened on his birthday had hurt me deeply, not because he didn't want a hug, but because of what he said and how he said it. When I repeated his words back to him, "You can't see," his breathing changed. He got defensive immediately, saying I was making a big deal out of nothing, that I'd embarrassed him in front of his friends, that everyone already treated him differently because of me. And that's when it all poured out. He told me kids had asked him if I could even recognize him, if I'd ever grabbed the wrong kid by mistake. He told me people joked about him having to take care of me someday. He told me his friends' parents looked at him with pity. And then he said the sentence that broke my heart clean in two. He said, "I just want to be normal." I didn't interrupt him. I let him talk, even when every word felt like another reminder of how my condition had affected him in ways I'd never fully understood. When he finished, there was that silence again, but it felt different now, heavier with truth. I told him I was sorry he'd gone through that. I told him I never wanted to be the reason he felt ashamed or burdened. But then for the first time, I didn't back down. I told him that his pain didn't give him the right to dehumanize me. I told him that pushing me away like that, especially in public, crossed a line. I told him I was blind, not broken, not contagious, not something to be hidden. He scoffed at first, said I didn't get it, and that's when I said something that surprised even me. I told him that if being around me was truly that unbearable for him, then maybe we needed to take a break. Not as a punishment, not as abandonment, but as a boundary. I told him I loved him too much to keep begging someone who treated me like an inconvenience. I could hear the shock in his voice when he asked if I was serious. I said yes. For the first time in his life, I wasn't chasing after him. I wasn't apologizing for existing. I was choosing myself. I left the school feeling like I'd just stepped off a cliff. My legs were shaky, my hands trembling, and the moment I got home, the doubt crashed in. Had I just made the worst mistake of my life? Had I pushed my own child away because I couldn't handle the pain? I cried that night, harder than I had in years, mourning a relationship that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. Weeks passed again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't just absence, it was tension, like something unresolved hanging in the air. Then one evening, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer because I couldn't handle another disappointment. But I did. It was him. He didn't apologize right away. He didn't soften his voice. He just said he'd been thinking about what I said. He said he didn't realize how often he'd treated me like I wasn't a real person. He admitted he'd been angry at the world and taking it out on me because I was safe, because I loved him no matter what. We met a few days later, just the two of us, at a quiet cafe I knew well. There was no hug when we saw each other, but there was no shove either. We talked for hours, about his fears, about my anger, about how neither of us had handled things perfectly. He admitted he'd been influenced by comments from his mother and others, not maliciously, but constantly, little remarks that added up. He said he hated feeling like he had to choose between defending me and fitting in. I told him something I'd never said out loud before. I told him being blind was the hardest thing I'd ever faced, but losing him would be worse. I told him I didn't need him to protect me or hide me or pretend everything was fine. I just needed basic respect. I needed him to see me as his parent, not his problem. That conversation didn't magically fix everything. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight, but something shifted. He started calling again, short conversations at first, then longer ones. He started coming over occasionally. There were still awkward moments, still times when I could feel his discomfort, but there was effort now. And effort changes everything. The real test came the following year on his next birthday. Smaller gathering this time, just family. When the cake was brought out and the candles lit, I stayed where I was, not wanting to put him on the spot again. The song ended, and there was that familiar pause. Then I felt someone step closer to me. He took my hand gently and leaned in. He didn't say anything, just held me there for a moment. It wasn't a dramatic apology or a public declaration, but it meant more than any speech ever could. Later that night, he thanked me for not giving up on him, but also for not letting him treat me badly. He said learning that I had boundaries had forced him to confront his own behavior. Hearing that didn't erase the pain of the past, but it softened it, turned it into something we could build from instead of something that defined us. So now, looking back on everything, I still ask myself that question I asked you at the beginning. Was I wrong to step back when my son pushed me away? Was I wrong to choose my own dignity, even when it risked our relationship? Or was that the only way to teach him how to love me properly? I don't have a perfect answer. What I do know is this: love without respect will eventually destroy both people involved, no matter how pure it starts. If you've made it this far, I really want to know what you think. Like this video if you believe I did the right thing by standing up for myself. Subscribe if you want to hear more real, messy stories like this one. And please, share your final thoughts on this whole situation in the comments, because I read them all. I'll see you in the next story.